In today's lesson, we'll be learning how to apply the midpoint of a line segment. In our first example, we want to determine an equation for the median from vertex C for the triangle with the vertices 5, 2, negative 3, 3, and 2, negative 5. Let's begin by deconstructing this question. Since we want to determine an equation, that means we're going to end up with the equation of a line in slope-intercept form. Meanwhile, a median is a line segment joining a vertex of a triangle to the midpoint of the opposite side. So as you can see here, that is the median. It goes from vertex C all the way to the midpoint of line segment AB. And I'm going to write these little lines to indicate that the lengths of these two portions are equal. And if you've forgotten, vertex is just a fancy word for corner, and vertices is plural of vertex. Since our goal is to find the equation of a median, which is a line, we'll need two things. We'll need to calculate the slope of this median as well as the y-intercept of this median. Let's try to calculate the slope of this median first. If you recall, you need 2 points in order to calculate slope. However, we only have 1 point, point C. We still need point M, which is the midpoint of line segment AB. Therefore, I'm going to arbitrarily call point A point 1 and label it x1, y1, and I'm arbitrarily going to call point B point 2 and call it x2, y2. The equation for midpoint is the sum of the x-coordinates divided by 2, and then the sum of the y-coordinates divided by 2. Our next step is to substitute in our known values. I know that x1 is negative 3, and I know that x2 is positive 2. I also know that y1 is positive 3, and y2 is negative 5. Let's simplify. So negative 3 plus 2 is negative 1. And 3 plus negative 5 is negative 2. I'm going to simplify this further. The fraction I'm going to leave alone. However, the other fraction I can simplify. So negative 2 divided by 2 is negative 1. Therefore, the midpoint coordinate is negative 1 over 2, negative 1. We just determined the coordinate of the midpoint, so let's label the diagram with that coordinate. That is negative 1 over 2 and negative 1. Since we have the coordinate of 2 points on the line which we want, we can determine the slope of that line. And slope is y2 minus y1 over x2 minus x1. At this point, you're just going to substitute in your known values. I'm going to use 2 as y2, and I'm going to use negative 1 as y1, and I'm going to use 5 as x2, and negative 1 over 2 as x1. Let's simplify some of these signs in our next step. So that just stays the same. When you have two negative signs, that becomes positive, and same thing for the denominator. Those become positive. 2 plus 1 is pretty simple. That is 3. Now, 5 plus 1 over 2, that's a little bit tricky. That's a fraction. Let's do the rough work over on the side. So 5 plus 1 over 2 is the same thing as 5 over 1 plus 1 over 2. Remember, in order to add or subtract fractions, you need a common denominator, and that common denominator is 2. So that's going to become 10 over 2 plus 1 over 2, and that is pretty simple. You're going to add the numerators, which is going to become 11, and the denominators stay the same, so that stays 2. So what we have here is 11 over 2. Again, this is a little bit tricky because you are dividing a number by a fraction. So when you divide by a fraction, you're really multiplying by the reciprocal. So you just have to flip the fraction. I'm going to change the 3 into a fraction, which is 3 over 1 times 2 over 11. Now, multiplying and dividing fractions a little bit easier. when you're multiplying fractions, you just have to multiply the numerators and multiply the denominator. So 3 times 2 is 6, and 1 times 11 is 11. Therefore, our slope is 6 over 11. We now know the slope of the median, and we determined that to be 6 over 11. However, if we want to find the equation of the median in slope-intercept form, we also need the y-intercept. So I'm going to plug in my slope value, and this is what I get. To determine the value of the y-intercept, you need to substitute in any point on the line. You can either substitute in the midpoint here, or you can substitute in this point. I'm going to substitute in point C, just because it's a little bit easier to work with. So I'm going to say sub 5, 2, so that becomes a 2, and that becomes a 5. At this point, all you need to do is simplify and solve for b. So the 2 stays the same. 6 over 11 multiplied by 5 is really the same thing as this. And like I said, when you're multiplying fractions, you just have to multiply the numerators. So 6 times 5 is 30, and 11 times 1 is 11. Remember, you want to isolate b, but b is stuck with this 30 over 11. To get rid of it, you need to subtract it from both sides of the equation. That's what I'm going to do. Those cancel out. To subtract 30 over 11 is a little bit tricky. You need to change 2 into a fraction. I'm going to write that over here. So 2 as a fraction is 2 over 1, but remember, before you can subtract or add fractions, you need a common denominator. The lowest common denominator of 1 and 11 is 11, so that becomes 22 over 11. And like I said, once you have a common denominator, you can go ahead and subtract the numerator. So 22 subtract 30 is -8, and the numerator stays the same. Therefore, our y-intercept is -8 over 11. We determined the slope of the median to be 6 over 11, and we also found the y-intercept of our median, and that turned out to be -8 over 11. Since you have the slope and y-intercept of the median, you can write its equation, which is y equals 6 over 11 x subtract 8 over 11.